let's move on to file system, where we do have a couple exercises that you'll be going through. And this is where you're going to start to see just how strong Node.js is compared to, or how strong an OS level or OS level language is compared to like a browser-based language and all the things you get access to. So file system, until Node.js, there really wasn't a great way to access the file system in JavaScript. I'm sure there was, but that it precedes me. By the time I started learning the program, there was Node.js. It was early, but it was around. So I don't know how you would have accessed the file system with JavaScript before Node.js, because JavaScript didn't really run outside of the browser. You can maybe click a button and upload a file if a user selected it, but you couldn't go query someone's file system in the browser. That would be a security risk. So I don't think there was a really good way to access someone's file system or a machine's file system with JavaScript before Node.js. And that's really powerful. But now that Node.js is here, just like any other OS level language, we do get access to the file system. And it's crazy because like when I first started learning about that, I was like, okay, cool. So I can do stuff with a file. I don't have any interesting files on my computer. Well, I don't understand why this is a big deal. But if you think about all the tools that you use, especially anything as far as front-end tooling, it's all just implementation or an abstraction around the file system. And that's how you get like some of those magical workflows, some of those things you can't live without, that it's just like, wow, I'm so glad that did that for me. It cleaned this up, it shortened this, it concatenated that, it joined this. Like those are file system projects, and it's a very powerful tool to have. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple templating solution with the file system. We're going to like render some HTML on the page, but not until we process it first, which is very similar to something you would do in Webpack or Babel or any other tool that you use to build your React or whatever front-end language that you have. So feel free to follow along. If you don't want to follow along, I do have all the code that we'll be using. You can copy and paste it directly from the course that I have here. So the first thing is we want to understand the FS module. So I'm going to go back to our project here, and I'm just going to delete this stuff out of here. And I'm going to rename this to MJS because, like I said, I'm going to use MJS going forward. If you don't want to use MJS, that's fine. Just know that all my exercises are going to use MJS. I'm going to use the latest modules. If you like CommonJS, if you want to do it, go ahead and do it. I just won't be doing that going forward. So first thing I want to do is understand the file system. So if we import FS from FS, which stands for file system, we get access to this super awesome package here. Let's log this out right quick. Oops, if I can spell console.log, there we go. You can see we get a bunch of stuff here, a bunch of really cool methods. I always like to log stuff. You can see we have things like a pin file sync, access sync, chown, or I don't know how you actually pronounce that, but I always pronounce it like ch own or whatever, but it's it's a file manipulation permission handler thing. Close, copy, exist, all this stuff, and you can see there's always like a sync version of it. That's really interesting, and that really just comes down to like how Node.js works. So if you don't use the sync version of a file system method, it's going to be asynchronous, as in it's going to be set aside in the event loop to be processed on the next tick at some point because it's asynchronous. We're going to continue to accept input throughout this node execution while this thing is being processed in the background, and then Node will notify us via a callback when it's done. So that's the asynchronous version. If you prefer to block the process of Node, as in, hey, do not move forward, do not process any other code, do not accept any other input until this is done, then you would use the sync version. And in most cases, you probably would never use the sync version of anything in Node.js. There are some rare ones where you literally don't want anything to happen, typically like on a server startup or some initialization where you just want everything to be done before the next thing happens because it only happens once. That's when you would do it. But if you're already like executing a server or something like that, you probably don't want one request coming in and blocking your entire server so no one else can actually hit your server because you're trying to upload an image. So yeah, you probably don't want to do that. So you typically will opt for the async methods of these file system methods, which are the ones that don't have the word sync after them. So like I said, there's a lot of interesting ones here, The ones that we're going to be interested in are going to be the read file and the write file. And we are going to use the async ones. And actually, FS was just updated to include, not only do they have the async ones, but they actually gave us this nice path to the FS module that has the async ones that are already wrapped with promises. Because before they were actually, you had to use them with callbacks, which is cool, but promises are better because we can async await them, which is amazing. So we're actually going to import from fs/promises. That way we get the permissified versions of the methods that we want. So now that we got that, the next thing we need to do is let's just get our template file. So we're going to copy this HTML here. Looks like standard HTML, but it's a little different, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it template.html, and I'm just going to paste it in here. So it looks like an HTML file, except if you go look at line 9 and line 10, you can see if you use any type of JavaScript framework, you notice that this looks like some type of interpolation. This looks like what JSX would have in the brackets. This is where you would insert some JavaScript. That's exactly right, because that's exactly what we're about to do. We're about to process this file, and we're going to replace these placeholder variables with actual JavaScript values using Node.js. So very similar to what you would have in JSX or Angular or Vue or Svelte or whatever framework you want. We're going to interpolate these values via Node.js without actually executing it in the browser. So in order to do that, we first need to import that, well, not import, we need to read the file. We need to get the string representation of that HTML file. That way we can find the variables that we want to replace and then replace them. So let's do that. We're going to use the read file method from FS. And I'm just going to go ahead and destructure up here because it's a named import, and I'm going to call it read file like that. So you can do that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the file. So I'm going to say const file, or let's just call it template, equals, and I'm going to await this because read file is a promise returning function. And in the latest version of Node, we do have access to async await. And I can actually use it on the root like this without having to wrap it in a function, which is also really cool. So I can say await read file. And then read file takes in this case, we're going to pass in 2 arguments. The first one needs to be the absolute path to the file that you want to read. Typically, what you would see in a common JS implementation is you would see something like, you would see someone import path from path, and then they would do something like path.join, and then they would say, I want to join from this directory name over to the template.html. And this would totally work back in comma.js. So if we try to execute this now, you'll see it's not going to work. And that's because dir name is not defined. And I know I said that dir name is a global in Node, and it is. I didn't lie to you. It definitely is. But only when you use common.js. You actually don't get access to dir name or file name inside of module.js. I found this out a couple months ago, and it's caused a really big bug in my app. This is why I said, yeah, just switching over to MJS and just thinking it's going to work, it's not really. You got to go in and fix all the stuff on a case-by-case basis because you get stuff like this, like such a big variable that doesn't exist anymore. Like, yeah, you probably have to make some changes. And the change that we're going to make is we're going to use, fortunately for us, read file also takes in a URL object, and we could construct a absolute path using the new URL implementation. So we can say new URL like this. And what this is going to take is 2 arguments. The first one is going to be like basically like the relative, like it's basically going to be like the file name that we want. So it's going to be, what do we want? We want template.html. So we want to go there, but then we want to set the base, which is going to be, we're going to grab something from import. So it's going to be import.meta.url. That's just basically, if we log this, I'll show you what this is. Get rid of that. So let's say console.log that, and then we might as well also just, yeah, we'll just log that so you can see what that is. And you can see it's literally the path to this file. It's the absolute path to this file. So that's going to be like the base of where we want to load from. And then we're going to pass in template HTML here. So it's going to be relative to that file. And now when we run this, I'm going to get rid of that log, and I'm going to console.log template. We should see some strange output here probably. Exactly. So we see this thing called a buffer. A buffer is like, it's like the little individual bits of, in this case, a file. It's all the little bits that make up a file. It's not a string, it's an implementation. It's when you want to stream something. And in that case, imagine if this file was a gigabyte. If we read this file in Node.js and loaded it up, we would have to load up a gigabyte in memory. And I don't know if that's something you want to do, especially if you have multiple files. So it's better to just stream them, bit by bit. And that's what a buffer is. It's literally us streaming the file. But this isn't useful if we need to do some processing, unless you want to do a process on a buffer, which I don't. So we need to convert this to a string, and then we can actually look at those variables, those placeholders, and then we can interpolate them with actual values. So that's what we'll do. We got a couple ways to do this. We could just call toString on the template, and that'll actually just convert it to a string because buffers have a toString method, and that works. And you can see we get our HTML back just fine. The other way we can do it is we can just go over to the second argument of read file, and we can pass in the format that we want here. And I'm just going to pass in UTF-8 like this. I said format, the encoding that we want to pass in here. And UTF-8 just basically means turn that into a string. And now I don't need the toString, and it still logs the HTML here. So step one, we read the file. We have it loaded up. It's a string now. It's inside of our Node.js file. So it was an HTML file on disk. Now it's a string in memory, and now we can process it. So the next strategy is to figure out how to replace these with some actual values. In a real implementation, you would probably use some other templating language. You would use some regex-based thing. We're going to do it the cheap way, and we're just going to loop over this and do like a string.replace and keep it simple. So first thing is, let's actually get the data that we want to swap out with these variables. So let's make an object here, and we'll call it data, and we'll have a title. And we'll call this learn Node.js. That's the title. And then I think the other one was a body. Yep. So then we'll have a body. And the body is, this is the final HTML. So we got our data now. And then the next thing we want to do is we can just loop over this data, and then we can just replace every single instance of the placeholders that match the key inside this, because the keys title and body match with the variables title and body. So we'll just match those using the replace method. We can say for consts, let's just say key value of object.entries. If you've never heard of object.entries, when you call object.entries and pass in an object to it, it's basically going to return an array of key value pairs, so tuples. So it'll be an array of arrays, and each array in the big array is going to have a key as its first value and the value as its second value. So in this case, I'm getting the key and the value of each key value pair, and I'm looping over them. So for each one of those, what I want to do is I just want to replace the placeholder. So I'm actually just going to turn this into a let, and I'm going to say template equals template.replace. And if you look at the placeholders, they start with this bracket and they close with this bracket, and then there's a variable name in the middle. So that's what we'll look for. So we'll say replace these brackets followed by the key here, and I want to replace it with the value, and that should be K. So I'm replacing everywhere where there's a bracket, key bracket with the actual value. So I'm going to replace that. I'm updating the template all along, and then I'm just going to log the template to see if it actually worked. So let's do that. And you can see we actually replaced those variables. We replaced where there was a bracket title with learn Node.js, and we replaced the paragraph tag with this is final HTML. Don't worry about these little arrows. That's just my terminal. It prints these arrows out. I think it's the font that I'm using. I don't know. I kind of like it, but no, it doesn't actually look like this. You won't have an arrow here. It's kind of confusing. But yeah, this totally works. So we're almost done. The next thing we need to do is we need to write this file back to the disk, because we do want this file to be loaded in the browser. We want to see it. We want it to be served by a server. We're going to deploy this somewhere, right? So we have to write this file back to the disk. Otherwise, what was the point of this? So the thing that we want to do here is we want to import another file called write file, which is pretty much the opposite of read file. So we're going to say await write file like this. And then it pretty much takes the same arguments as read file does. So we're going to say new URL, like, oops, nope, not that, this one. And we're going to pass in the name of the file that we want. In this case, let's just call it index.html, like that. And then imports.meta.url, which, by the way, I think there's a lot of different approaches to solve the fact that we don't have dir name and file name inside of MJS. This is just the way that I've settled on. This is the way that I've seen other libraries and frameworks approach this problem, and it's something that I've just settled on. But if you were to Google, like, well, how do we get around no dir name or file name in MJS files, you will probably find a lot of different solutions. This is the one that has been consistently great for me. So we're going to write the file, and then we want to, as a second argument, pass in the file that we want to write. In this case, it's the template string. So we're going to await, and we're going to write that file, and we should see it pop up here on the left when we execute this code. So let's give it a try. So I'm going to do that. There was no output here because I didn't log anything. Because the output was exactly this index.html being written to the disk. So if I go check it out, you can see we're all good here. And just to check to make sure it's valid HTML, I can open with, not that, I'm going to open, where is it? I'm going to, oh yeah, revealed in Finder. And then I'm going to double click that. And you can see it's a real HTML website. We just processed some HTML similar to what a build tool that you've probably been using for quite some time does. So that's really powerful. Obviously, Webpack is more than this. TypeScript is more than this. Babel is more than this. But at its foundation, at its core, it's reading your files as strings in memory, and it's processing them with complicated plugin systems and architectures and edge case protections and all types of crazy things. But at the end of the day, that's what it's doing to the file system. It's reading it and then it's writing it. Right? If you've ever used Webpack or Babel or TypeScript and you use a CLI and it's like, give us the input file that you want us to start with and give us an output directory to output to, they're writing to it. They're reading from it. That's exactly why they need those arguments. So that's a really powerful feeling. I know when I started reading and writing files, one of the first things that I built was a starter, like I always built, at the time I built like everything in like Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node, so like the mean stack. So I built a little system that would basically scaffold out the start of how I like to build an app. So it's like a little scaffolding tool. And that was like the first thing that I built with the file system. And I thought that that was really powerful. So any questions on the file system or anything that I just covered? That's a good question. Aha. So await, let's talk about that. Let me go back to the code. So what is await and what is it doing here? Good question. So we have to understand how asynchronous code works in JavaScript. So I'm not going to go deep into that because there are so many amazing courses on Front-End Masters that can talk about that much better than I can in this course. But the short answer is read file and write file are asynchronous tasks, as in they actually execute in the background. So what I'm saying is, we'll get to await, but let's say I just remove this await. What's actually going to happen is when JavaScript looks at this file on line 3, or this line on line 3, it's going to initiate this function, but it's not going to wait around for it to be finished. It's going to task it to happen later on in the background, and then it's going to continue to move on. Now that's going to cause problems because, as you can see on line 11, I expect there to be something called template available. But if I don't wait for it, this would actually just be undefined, and my code's not going to behave the way that I intended it to. So there are different ways to get around that in Node.js or just JavaScript in general. The standard way is to use a callback. So if we didn't use FS promises and we decided just to use FS, I would actually pass in a callback here like this. I would say like error result. And this callback would be called when the read file was done. And then I would have to move all of this code into this callback because I don't want that code to be executed until a read file is done. And as you can see, that starts to get sloppy. You have callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks. So we solved that with something called promises. So now if you have a promise, what you can do instead of doing a callback is you can actually just do something called .then right after this, which kind of looks like a callback, but it's not. And then I would just move everything inside of this dot then, which it doesn't expand out this way. It stays flat, but it's still not the best looking way. It still doesn't read top from bottom. Like when we look at code, we read it from top to bottom. And when it stops behaving that way, it can get very confusing. And dot then keeps it closer from top to bottom, but it's still not quite there. You still have these callbacks inside the dot then. So we built another abstraction on top of that, and that's called async await. So now if you have a function that does return a promise, which these functions do, they do return promises, you could prefix the promise with a keyword called await, which will stop JavaScript from moving on until this asynchronous piece of code was done. It is the equivalent of moving all of the code into the callback like I just showed you. Instead, visually, we don't have to do that, and we could feel confident that this code won't execute until this is done or errored out.
Yeah, do we not have to provide the async keyword, or is it implicit?
Got you. Yeah, so that is a new feature in the latest version of Node. You do not have to apply the async keyword anymore inside of a function. You're good. You can use it flat globally now. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, if it's top level like I have here, you don't need the async because there's nowhere to add it. But if you do have a function, like for instance, if I have a function called, get users like this, oops, go away. I can't just say awaits something like this. I can't say awaits db dot get user, not debugger, db dot get users. Like I can't do that, right? That's not going to happen because you have to put async in front of this, like that. So yeah, it's only for top level, which is something relatively new and extremely powerful. But yeah, if you're inside of a function, you do have to put the async keyword before your parameters on that function.